This is episode 261 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, we are here because we are going to review the dreaded year of 2020. Of course, news does not stop for any podcast, so we are going to wrap up a few items from the end of the year here before we move on to really running through in chronological order a lot of the major issues, mostly here in New Mexico policy, also national politics that impacted New Mexico dramatically. So buckle in, folks. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
There may be some turbulence, and hopefully
you definitely want one of those bags that you can get sick into, because 2020 was not pretty. Well, speaking of not pretty, there is the federal budget situation after the second major, I guess it would be correct to say, stimulus plan. Now, this is one we talked about last week on the podcast when we had this conversation. We thought it was a done deal. I think everybody thought it was a done deal then.
Except the president had his questions I guess after that. So,
and obviously it's the whole piece of legislation had a lot in it. This is $600 checks. This is extended unemployment insurance. This is a lot of shady, questionable special interest favors in, and it is two bills joined. There's kind of a federal spending bill, $1.4 trillion, as well as $900 billion in COVID relief. All of it is definitely open to question. The one provision in the COVID relief bill that really caught our attention that maybe isn't quite going to get the headlines of some of the other issues is that essentially in the CARES Act, the money that was sent to the states could be used. It wasn't explicitly stated, but it was allowed to be used for private schools or school options for parents and families. That is explicitly prohibited in the bill that passed Congress and now has been signed by the president. So very, very frustrating that is the case. Generally speaking, though, just an ugly way to end the year. While we're sympathetic with Trump wanting to veto it, Biden called this a down payment, and that means more debt, more COVID spending here in the next year. What would that entail? How is that going to look? Obviously we're going to have a evenly divided Congress in both houses, but boy, not a very pretty finish to a very ugly year politically.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was an ugly bill any way you look at it. There is so much junk in there. And speaking of which, I saw a post that you had done on Facebook, Paul, that you listed out some of the things that you thought were questionable. And Facebook said, well, they warned me that there was lacking of context in your post. So what did that mean? It's like if something is pork barrel garbage and you just call it out, you need to say, but what was the context that Facebook was looking for? And that's one of the frustrations, I think, with the bill in general. The president was, put between a rock and a hard place, and he chose, one of the last decisions, frankly, that he'll be making of his administration, assuming Biden is seated. But this was an ugly, ugly bill. There's no question about that.
Yeah, and I guess the context that Facebook was probably looking for was that these were two separate bills, and the kind of special interest goofiness was part of both of them. But
yeah, so
it really just because you dump two crap sandwiches together doesn't make the crap sandwich any less untasty. And uh, yeah, I'm not thrilled with the president's hill to die on being $2,000 checks. Now, if he had said, get rid of the special interest garbage and give the money to the American people. And by special interest garbage, it could be foreign aid payments to every country on the face of the planet. Not every, but a lot of countries got chunks of money in this big smorgasbord. There were other, obviously the teacher unions had something in there to prohibit money but from being used for private and school choice options. Just let's not do any more damage to the federal budget than has already been done at this point in a very challenging year for the federal budget, where I've seen the quote, and I don't know who said it, but are we all modern monetary theorists now? Those are basically people who just believe that as long as the U.S. Is considered a country that has seigniorage, that can print money, that we can print as much money as we want and not have any problems. And it seems to be that both sides in Washington are under that impression, and that is only going to pick up, I suspect, under a Biden administration. Of course, the underlying thing here is the states like New Mexico that have locked down severely are, of course, in most dire need of large handouts from Washington, D.C. Other states, they're looking at it and saying, we have 3.1, 3.5% unemployment rate. Our people are doing fine, but New Mexico is, of course, not one of those states.
Yeah, and on the theme of are we all modern monetary policy theorists? You know, our economy is in a tough shape for lots of reasons. In New Mexico, for sure, but things are not all rosy. And if modern monetary policy is not true, and I have my doubts. It's one of those that's never been true anywhere it's been tried. It's always fails eventually. You need to keep your powder dry. We could have massive recession. We could have dips and troughs from COVID. As positive as the news is about a vaccine, it's not all positive, and there's a lot of people that don't want it. And, there could be a lot of things happen. And, wastefulness is never a good thing, but it could become a matter of, national security at the rate we're going, where we might need some federal money to continue to address very real problems. And we might look back fondly at the times where we felt comfortable wasting hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in a COVID bailout package at the end of the Trump administration.
Yeah, now, before we get into, again, the chronological year in review, the dominant issue, of course, of 2020, and I wrote in my show notes, I wanted to make sure, this is the dominant issue of 2020 in a way that no other issue has really dominated a year, with the exception, maybe going back to World War II or the Great Depression. I can't remember a single year where you had this kind of constant focus by everybody. There was no escaping unless you lived in one of those open states, like a South Dakota, which is a relatively small portion of our national population. Very few people were not impacted directly by the government shutdowns. And then, of course, others were impacted directly through having sick or dead family members. But truly, the way that most of us have experienced COVID-19, just numerically, has been through losing jobs, losing freedom to go out of the house, losing freedom to associate, losing freedom to engage in religious services, etc. So truly, COVID-19 had dramatic impacts in ways that I don't think, heading into even just 2020, any of us could have ever fully appreciated or understood. Now, when we talk about what happened this year, it's worth noting that politicians and our so-called experts got a lot of things wrong. And I'm looking at a article from the American Institute for Economic Research. 12 times the lockdowners were wrong, published the day after Christmas 2020. Number one, Anthony Fauci says lockdowns are not possible in the United States. Now, I'm not sure exactly what he means by that statement because everybody's definition of a lockdown has a bit of difference in it. But 43 of 50 U.S. states were considered to be under lockdown by some definition of the word, of course, including New Mexico. So we might not have had soldiers stationed outside everybody's front doors, but I think New Mexico has been sufficiently locked down on two different occasions. Would you agree, Wally?
Oh, I think there's no question about that. We're absolutely locked down. And the in addition to the explicit lockdowns, some of the nonsensical, subtle lockdowns that come of that are starting to take their toll on New Mexico as well.
No doubt about it. Number two, and we're going to have to move quick, so I
Yep.
encourage you to check this story out, folks listening or watching. U.S. government and WHO officials advised against mask use back February and March. This one got a fair amount of publicity, but the impact of masks has been hotly debated throughout this entire pandemic. It is worth noting that there were clear statements on part of Fauci and other prominent health officials saying that masks should not be worn, not just that they weren't necessary or they might not be effective, but that they actively should not be worn. So that is important. Fauci's decimal error in estimating COVID fertility rates. That was March 11th. That's my line of demarcation for when the stuff really hit the fan here in New Mexico. He said it was 10 times more lethal than the seasonal flu. And it is worth noting that not just Fauci, but others seem to have a even more deadly vision of what COVID-19 meant. Not that it hasn't affected many, many lives, but the number of deaths that they were talking about at the outset was quite significant compared to where we are even today, as grim as things have been in that area.
Yeah, they considered it likely to be like the 1918 flu and possibly even worse. So that's initially, that has proven, thankfully, not to be the case. But a lot of the policies that were put in place under that assumption seem to be still living with, as you have said, questionable effectiveness in terms of really slowing COVID.
2 weeks to flatten the curve. This one is a critical one. We're on 10 months to flatten the curve now. This was, the early policy was let's all stay inside. And, I think people were generally sympathetic to that. Try to socially distance, not to spread the virus around so that we don't overwhelm the hospitals. Now, subsequently, of course, as recently as here in November, hospitals in New Mexico, for example, did become overwhelmed. But back in March, April, early on in this whole thing, hospitals were not overwhelmed in New Mexico and generally around the country. And one of the notes they say in this article is people famously remember the U.S. Navy hospital ship being sent to New York. Well, when that ship departed New York a month later, it had served only 182 patients. The article also states that a pop-up hospital in the Javits Convention Center in New York sat mostly empty. So there was a very early on concern that just hospitals were going to be swamped. And I don't work in a hospital. I don't know exactly how things shook out in New Mexico's hospitals or around the country, but it certainly lasted a long time beyond 2 months. And obviously 2 months, 2 weeks, and 2 weeks was nowhere near enough to flatten the curve, if in fact it was ever going to flatten any curves in the hospital situation.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And then I know we're doing the year in review, but I do think the issue of 2020 for New Mexico is how do we exit some of these COVID plans, because right now that's not looking very
Right.
helpful, very hopeful, or very promising in terms of the health orders that are in place right now in New Mexico.
Neil Ferguson, who was a so-called expert on the virus, predicted a best-case U.S. scenario of 1.1 million deaths. This was on March 20th. We'll just leave that there because it's kind of in line with some of the worst-case scenarios. Of course, we've had somewhere on the order of 300,000, 350,000, maybe at this point. 1 million is potential if we suddenly get another peak, but I don't think that is going to happen. Sweden, at the Imperial College, they said 95,000 deaths in Sweden by the early summer. Uh, they've wound up, let's see, 6 months later, Sweden had about 8,000 deaths. So, each death is tragic, but when you're talking about 96,000, 8,000, it looks a lot better. Scientists suggest ocean spray, not the cranberry juice, but the actual ocean spray, can spread COVID-19 on April the 2nd. There, folks with beaches like New York, mostly California, I should say, possibly in New York, but certainly in California, they were very aggressive about keeping people socially distanced, even in ocean water and various beach environments. Number 8, Neil Ferguson predicts catastrophic U.S. death toll in states that reopen on May 24th. Again, you could go across the board and see states that have enacted the strictest and not enacted very many regulations, and it's very difficult to tell one from the other across the United States. Uh, Fauci, number 9, credits the lockdown for beating the virus in Europe, July 31. Well, we obviously had the fall resurgence, so that has not worked out very well. We're going to skip over Australia, and then renewed lockdowns are just a straw man. October, there was scientists saying that folks who had put together the Great Barrington Declaration, which was basically an anti-lockdown document signed by numerous thousands of public health officials and others, that there was not going to be another round of lockdowns. And of course, that has very much been the case, that there have been other lockdowns, including what we're dealing with now. And then number 12, the final time they were wrong, at least one of the final times. Anthony Fauci touts New York as a model for COVID containment. That is just crazy talk because
Yeah, to this day, as you look at the data across the United States, what COVID numbers look like with and without New York and New Jersey, it's striking. So
yeah, the United States, has had a mixed record. Now, as I look at the World O Meters data, we are 14th from the top in deaths per million. So we've actually gone somewhat in the right direction in terms of dropping relative to other nations. But New York is second highest as of this recording among U.S. states. New Jersey, deaths per million is tops. New York is second. Massachusetts third. And then you go down through several other states, and New Mexico is 17th in terms of the deaths per million. So we're not exactly performing well here in the land of enchantment relative to people actually dying relating to COVID-19. But we're certainly not in as bad of a situation as New York. So we will quickly move beyond that. It's definitely an article worth reading. There's a lot to get to during this podcast. And that's kind of the most recent current events. We had to go into some kind of discussion of COVID-19 and just the broad issues relating to it, because that has been such a dominant issue. But let's get in our time machines, Wally. Go back all the way to January we can maybe gaze at old pictures of people in restaurants eating in somewhat close proximity. And
Yeah, shaking hands at events and saying hello to people in person. Lots of things were going back
maybe
on
even
in
hugging
January.
at the
Oh,
roundhouse.
yes, a lot of hugging at the Roundhouse.
Yeah, some may be more welcome than others in terms of the roundhouse, but we will leave that aside. But yes, the 30-day session that began in January was a session like any other, relatively speaking. Democrats were in control, as they tend to be, and oil money was flowing in and faster than even those folks could spend it. The legislature passed a $7.6 billion budget. It was a 21% increase in just 2 years. Happy days. We're here again. Of course, that's not for fans of limited government like ourselves. SB 5, the worst bill of the session, a red flag bill, passed a terrible bill, HB 364, which really was the sausage factory in action, which was a massive giveaway to public employee unions. That bill passed. That one was a former bill that got put into a dummy bill. The unions would not be denied. And HB 83, which created a $320 million fund for early childhood education. Of course, again, this was when times were just rocking and they didn't even know what to do with the money. Of course, times have not gone as well since then, and they still kept that fund intact. So there's $300 million just sitting around for that. The only good news out of the session, well, there's some. There was a reform of the public employee retirement program. There are two programs. The ERB has not been reformed yet, but PARA was put on a firmer footing. Michelle Lujan Grisham's scheme for free college failed. And so there were a few positives that come out of the session. But overall, it was all about mitigating the harm done in Santa Fe.
Yeah, absolutely. And the appetite for revenue while things were good was seemingly insatiable. And it's going to be interesting to see with the massive slowdown in the New Mexico economy, what that will manifest itself in just a few short weeks in Santa Fe as things go forward. I have a feeling there will be some more tax bills, much along the lines of what happened in the last session, albeit with a lot deeper hole to dig out of.
Yeah, and it will be interesting. Of course, we've got two special sessions to address here in terms of things that happen after the original session. But we did have a fantastic event. Unfortunately, while the Rio Grande Foundation typically has a lot of events, we were hampered in that by the fact that everybody was pretty much closed. We did have some Liberty on the Rocks functions, and we're going to try to get back to that in January. But of course, we're still under the red flag of death of Michelle Lujan Grisham in terms of restaurants not being open. And so we'll have to do what we can. But Josh Blackman is a professor of law at South Texas College. He is active and often quoted about, judicial issues, courts. He's written some books, including one about Obamacare. And he did a really great presentation for us. We'll hope to have some events here as hopefully things get going in a more solid direction. But I certainly didn't think back when we had that event with Josh in early March of 2020 that it would be the only speaker event we had in person in the year 2020.
Yeah, we really do. As much as we like Zoom, as much as we like podcasting and doing things on Facebook Live, YouTube, everywhere else, that's having people in person, man, that is something that we really do look forward to, and hopefully we'll see in the not too distant future.
And then again, right as things were getting rolling, unfortunately, with COVID-19, we did have some good news at the Rio Grande Foundation because we won a ethics complaint against Mayor Tim Keller here in the city of Albuquerque over his use of the City of Albuquerque website for electoral advocacy. He had specific messages at cabq.gov saying vote yes on bonds, vote yes for this, vote yes for that, and that's really not something that should be done with taxpayer resources. Something that's an informational tool, not a campaign tool. He can go out and speak and campaign and have his underlings and minions and friendly lefty groups out advocating for various issues. I believe this was on also Democracy Dollars was part of this. I don't remember if he specifically encouraged people to vote for it, but definitely shouldn't use city resources. So that was the last bit of good news before March 11th, and then all hell broke loose. March 11th, again, it was a Wednesday. We had a Liberty on the Rocks, actually, that evening in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And that's when the governor really started canceling things. The Bataan Death March event that happens in southern New Mexico was one of them. Public schools, of course, were no longer in person. They had spring break coming up, but kids were kind of shunted into these. As bad as the virtual learning model is for most students right now, it was even worse as it was thrown together. I think they got an extra week off at that time, but it was just a very chaotic and challenging time. And then the Rio Grande Foundation filed a lawsuit against the city and city councilors for violating open meeting laws as they were meeting to give Mayor Keller enhanced powers under the city's Emergency Act. And this is the one where they could stop selling guns and ammo and shut down roads. And there was a lot of real issues. This was a historical old law that they were looking to, essentially authorize the mayor to do a lot of things. And unfortunately, our lawsuit was unsuccessful, but I guess you can say that it was the first of many unsuccessful lawsuits by folks trying to push back against the sweeping array of government powers that have been arrogated into just a few people since this crisis began. Of course, Mayor Keller being one, but Governor Lujan Grisham being the notable one.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, as issues to look for in the coming year, even with the extremely liberal and progressive legislature, there's a talk on both sides of the aisle about possibly modifying some of these and building some review mechanisms into this incredible amount of power that rests in the administrative functions of New Mexico, particularly at the governor, and to a lesser extent, as you talked about, in places like the the mayor of Albuquerque.
Yeah, and I guess the worst aspects of the city of Albuquerque laws were obviated or preempted by the state's own laws, and so really, because the states have the ultimate sovereignty, the city's laws weren't truly effective anyway. It's complicated legalistic stuff, but the fact is that the mayor doesn't necessarily have a lot more power thanks to this rule. It's really coming from the governor, and she gets to, tell local officials and hope that they'll enforce everything she wants them to enforce, which she, of course, has had some success, but some failure in getting agreements from not just Republicans, but, Manny Gonzalez, the sheriff, Bernalillo County, others in terms of enforcing everything that she has tried to impose. Now, on the flip side of kind of that frustration there at the city, we did push for, in the Albuquerque Journal and elsewhere, a waiver to Albuquerque's ban on plastic bags at grocery stores. I know it's a thin
a thin victory.
Yeah.
Yeah. About 10 mils thick, as a matter of fact, somewhere in there.
I mean, the Rio Grande Foundation worked very hard for a long time as this issue was brought forth, not just in Albuquerque, but in Santa Fe. The Albuquerque ban was passed and was taking effect, I think, right at the beginning of January is when it took effect in 2020. And then just as the guessing family's stockpile of dog poop bags was about to run out, COVID-19 came along, and suddenly plastic bags were everywhere at our local Walmarts and other grocery stores because uh, really, I don't know how many cities or governments around the country, if any of them have active uh, plastic bag bans in place, but I know even San Francisco and others also repealed their bans, at least temporarily. And this did land the Rio Grande Foundation in the New York Times, and they did one of their awesome hit pieces where they claimed that we were acting on behalf of the Koch brothers and tried to essentially make us look like we were some tool of some outside entity, when in reality, again, I don't know that you could find a city or state plastic bag ban that has withstood the COVID-19 situation. And, it's obviously a small victory, but we'll take them where we can get them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is interesting to be attacked like that, given that supposedly COVID changed everything. Well, why wouldn't it change the plastic bag ban? Should we be bringing used bags in that we've been fumbling around in our fingers, in addition to all of the bacteria from leftover chicken and hamburger juice from the last time we came to the store?
Right.
But it's not enough to have good policy. We have to attack somebody. And congratulations, Paul, it was you. So
Yeah. So I think the open question as we head forward is when whatever that new normal we're going to hit kicks in, will these plastic bag bans return, or will cooler heads prevail and folks realize that maybe this isn't the wisest policy to have in place? But only time will tell. We're certainly a ways away from any new normal here in New Mexico. Now, in late March, we referred to the CARES Act earlier and the latest stimulus round. Well, in late March, Congress passed and Trump signed the $2 trillion CARES Act. So that's very quick action on behalf of Congress. I mean, we really, like I said, March 11th is the line of demarcation in my mind. So we're talking less than 2 weeks from when things really started here in New Mexico to when they passed a federal stimulus package of $2 trillion. And this is in some contrast. We thought back in the real olden days, Wally Drangmeister, when the federal, the housing crisis and all that stuff happened, 700, 800 billion dollars. You had Tea Party folks coming out of the woodwork. You had all kinds of, people really expressing outrage about that. And here, $2 trillion passed with barely a blink of an eye, and then another 900 billion on top of that. So we've done a lot of adding of red ink to the equation here, the budget, but it's something that $2 trillion. Now, if I had one statement to make about strategic mistakes, political mistakes that came out of that original, it should have been Trump saying, look, this is $2 trillion. This is a lot of money by any standard. You governors, you have to manage this system now, this situation now. You have to understand that you have to get your economies going and balance virus concerns with economic and individual liberty concerns. Uncle Sam is not going to be there again to bail you out, at least as long as I'm in the White House. He did not, to my knowledge, make that point clear. Not that maybe he even is able to hold that line in the sand, but he obviously didn't put that line in the sand. That line was washed away very quickly, and now we have another massive addition to the federal debt that at some point someone is going to have to pay back, or we're just going to lose the value of our currency.
Well, and I won't even start with a lot of people, particularly politicians and the media, that seemingly don't know the difference between a million, a billion, and a trillion. But 2 trillion is a lot of money, and it's tough to conceptualize. But the entire federal budget, and it's one of those. There's a lot of ways they play games. So what really is the federal budget, given that we do so much deficit spending, and there's Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, but it's somewhere around $4.5 trillion. So we spent almost a half a year's worth again of federal spending, total federal spending in 3 weeks. So that was indeed very quick action. And as you said, it's a huge amount of money. And not that it necessarily should have come with explicit strings attached at that point, but I think that that was a huge teaching moment in terms of, can the federal government, how many more times can the federal government do that? I don't think it's infinite, and I certainly don't think it numbers in double digits. We may have emergencies that need this sort of thing again, but I don't think we can do it 5, 10, 15, 20 times without having huge consequences for the dollar and for the economy of the United States.
So about a month after the initial shutdown really took effect here in New Mexico on April the 13th, I posted on Airs of Enchantment. It might be the single most trafficked post that we've done in the entire history of this blog. This is at a time when there's a lot of fear still out there. Very few people are pushing back. My post simply said, 8 shutdown decisions MLG should consider reversing right now. Of course, this is posted in mid-April. Without going into all of them, reopening medical facilities to outpatient procedures, reopening the 35 state parks, especially the ones with the lakes. Golf courses should be open. Nurseries should be open, at least if they went with social distance guidelines. Gun stores should remain open. Liquor stores, churches should be open. They were open to only 5 people at a time at that particular time frame. And then restaurants should have been reopened. We said that they should embrace social distance guidelines such as were available to the big box stores at the time. And that generated quite a lot of interest and support. And, I wish that it was more adhered to or more considered by the powers that be, but it was not. And then shortly after that, and by the way, just as a general thought, we've talked about the way the Rio Grande Foundation can be flexible and nimble in times of rapidly changing climates, politically speaking. And obviously the March through April, May was among the most rapidly changing time periods we've ever seen in New Mexico's political history. And so the Rio Grande Foundation's very pleased to be able to respond so quickly and do so without bureaucratic, troubles that some organizations might have. But April 17th, we created the New Mexico version of the Taxpayer Protection Pledge, which essentially says that for the duration of 2020 and then into 2021, taxes should not be raised. We collected signers. We engaged in a postcard and social media campaign to educate people what candidates and politicians were signing such pledges and what were not. It was well received. I think it had some very significant impacts in both the primary election and the general election. Obviously, it didn't necessarily tilt the balance of power in any one house or race necessarily, but it certainly is something that we are going to continue to try to hold the line on taxes as we hit the 2021 session.
Yes, it is interesting, this whole idea about the impact of taxes and what impact it has on an economy. Dave Heil, the guest on the Thursday podcast, addressed this a lot, and it's something that I really do think is lost on New Mexicans. And during these COVID times, if we totally forget that, It's so much easier to pass taxes than it is to ever repeal them or scale them back. I think our state is at a point where if we in a lot of taxes, quote, on an emergency basis, they'll be here forever. One of my favorite taxes is the emergency school tax that they charge oil.
Mm-hmm.
That's going on some 50 or 60 years that it's been an emergency. So I hope we don't see any emergency taxes because those have a way of hanging around forever and ever and ever. And I just don't think that New Mexico's economic situation can handle that.
Yeah, and speaking of economic situations that our state can't handle, on April 20th, oil prices went negative for the first time in recorded history, for lack of a better term. That obviously has not held, it didn't hold for more than a day or so. It's obviously shifted dramatically. Now oil prices are somewhere in the $40 a barrel range, but still it highlighted some real concerns with New Mexico's over reliance on oil and natural gas. Not that we shouldn't use those and benefit from those, but we've been talking for a very long time about those tax reform issues and other policies that would enable New Mexico to diversify its economy. On April the 23rd, RGF and Power the Future, our friend over there, we released the Fairly Open New Mexico website, which we tried to essentially rally New Mexicans and their policymakers around two basic ideas. I really, again, thought the name Fairly Open was really good because it talked about fairly opening New Mexico's businesses and giving basic parameters in terms of social distancing and other ways that they could ensure the safety of their customers. And it opened them, said if you can apply these, you can open your business. And then fairly open was also implying that the process should be open. The information should be shared. And I think Lujan Grisham and David Scrace have gotten somewhat better very, very recently within the last few months in terms of what they are saying. But still, we've seen too many cases of hiding the football and just changing the entire approach for not much in the way of good reasons during this entire process. So a really frustrating situation because I thought Fairly Open was a very sound approach, and we've really not seen that from our governor in our state at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a lot of frustration in certain businesses. Bars are still not open in New Mexico. Other states have 20% open. And there's been a lot of micromanaging without, really being based on broad themes and, quote, strategies that should be generally applicable. It's like, no, you get to open, you don't get to open. And then when there's a follow-up question of why that is, there isn't, initially there was nothing forthcoming. As you said, I think they've gotten a little better, but there are still a lot of micro rules in this where they pick winners and losers. And man, if you're on the losing side, it's brutal for some of those businesses.
Yep. We're going to move a little quicker here from a few of them. We had some really great Liberty on Quarantine Zoom discussions with each of the Republican candidates for U.S. Senate, Gavin Clarkson, Elisa Martinez, and Mark Ronchetti. That was something that was fun to do in a different context that may not have been as interesting to folks, but definitely got some attention and got some interest, and those candidates able to share their views on various issues. On May the 8th, I sat down with KOB Channel 4 and talked about grocery delivery taxation. If you got your groceries delivered, which is increasingly popular under COVID-19, you got them delivered to your home, suddenly the entire order became taxable under gross receipts tax, and that could result in significant increases to your overall spending there, thanks to that policy. In mid-May, Bill Richardson, of all people, echoed Rio Grande Foundation's calls for restaurants and other businesses to be allowed to open. He also said that the legislature should not raise taxes and that Social Security taxes should actually be eliminated entirely. He did this in an Albuquerque Journal op-ed, which I can promise you we will remind folks in Santa Fe of at every opportunity. Then riots over Memorial Day weekend broke out in Albuquerque over the George Floyd shooting. Downtown, which had already, our downtown has never been the greatest. It was certainly beaten up significantly by COVID-19. And then the property damage that happened in downtown Albuquerque made downtown really a ghost town. So it's just been really tough all around. And then finally, and definitely, Wally, I want to talk a little bit about this. In early June, primaries were held. Both parties, moderate Democrats were wiped out, especially in the Senate. And it's going to change the face of the legislature. The new group hasn't been in office yet, so we've had these special sessions with the old group of legislators, but this new group is going to be much more so-called progressive, and it's really going to, I think, move our entire state political policies quite a bit to the left. But that was planted back in June in this primary election.
Yes, and one of my hopes, which in politics and in business, hope is not a strategy, but it is what I have to hang my hat on. At times when a political group is in the minority, it's easy for them to spout off policies because they know there's not much of a chance that they'll be enacted. Mm-hmm. I think that the progressives are good about doing that. You're throwing raw meat to their base. But then when there's a majority, there's some saner logic comes to prevail. But I'm not sure that's the case in New Mexico, because I think that these it just seems like this the progressive policy is just this force, somewhat like a tsunami. It's just, it's amazing the power that it has right now, and it doesn't show any times of sign of slowing down soon. And so when you have the progressive mindset, which means there's no tax that you don't like and no spending that you don't like, and when your economy is struggling, like New Mexico's economy is struggling, it's very concerning for anyone who lives here, and particularly anyone who works here or owns a business or is looking at, expanding their business. Any of those things, just very problematic. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Not a whole lot to add to that, except to say that no politician, to my knowledge, no progressive has ever been defeated for going too far off of the deep end politically in this state. And until there is electoral consequences for being too far to the left, that is going to be the trend in office. You've seen, a lot of battles over moderate Democrat seats with Republicans and Democrats going after those seats, but Democrat districts, progressive voters, every one in those areas, they do not seem inclined to punish even the worst, most corrupt, problematic legislators, and there are plenty. I'm not going to get into them right now. The special session was held in June. It sliced the budget to about $7.1 billion, tapped some reserves, not the permanent fund, but a rainy day fund. We actually genuinely had a rainy day fund, Federal CARES Act money. All of that kept the budget afloat, and that's really been the strategy from day one, is to not do much on the economy, to just hope that Washington will bail us out. Then on June the 30th, right as we were heading into the 4th of July weekend, Albuquerque City Council faced a vote on hazard pay and mandatory paid sick leave. They punted on sick leave again, rejected the hazard pay. So at least some success there. And of course, they subsequently again punted on mandatory paid sick leave. Of course, that's all memorable for me because my family was heading out of New Mexico to Yellowstone National Park. The governor's quarantine took effect as we were out of town, but I was not shy about showing pictures and discussing that. I'm not going to go into as much detail here, but you can find all the details on errorsofenchantment.com. Then we had a study and an article in the Albuquerque Journal, thanks to Catherine Stevens, early childhood education expert with the American Enterprise Institute. She really debunked the case for pre-K New Mexico, and especially a LFC report that kind of touted the supposed success of pre-K and early childhood in spending, and that was a very well researched and convincing article, but I don't think it's going to matter in Santa Fe here when the legislature reconvenes. Right after that, the Guessing family announced its decision to homeschool their children, and we had a full podcast on that. Then on August 4th, Marathon Refinery said they were closing their Gallup facility. I think that's been closed since the onset of COVID-19, but that was a decision to completely close it. That's going to be a big blow to Gallup and the tax base out there. And then carryover from 2019, Clarissa Pena, city councilor, announced that she'll pay back the city for her costly cross-country train trip that she embarked upon for a meeting allegedly in New York City. And she doesn't like to fly, but she took all of her kids and husband up to New York and really was sticking it to the taxpayers. We did some work on that and called attention to it late 2019. So she announced in August that she was going to repay that money. And then on August 13th, Wally, President Trump signed an executive order that extended $400 in unemployment benefits, with $300 of that coming from the federal government and the additional $100 expected to come from the states. Lujan Grisham at that time was complaining on social media constantly about Trump and the unemployment issue and how he was not acting and Congress wasn't acting and this and that and the other. When it came time for New Mexico and for the governor to put up extra $100 on unemployment, crickets.
Yes, the whole issue is spending other people's money, but in this case, spending only federal money, not putting any state money to back it up, and that's a theme to keep an eye on going forward, because we have a unemployment fund that's basically depleted, and if we're going to try to rebuild that on the backs of struggling businesses in too short a time period, I'm convinced that's one of the most underreported stories in New Mexico of the recovery from the 2007, 2008 downturn, that we could be facing a very, very slow recovery if something isn't done to invest some state money into that fund, as opposed to just make all the restaurants that are shut down pay for it within a couple of months. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, and then in mid-August, California suffered rolling blackouts and electricity reliability issues, in part due to their green policies. They're definitely cutting edge when it comes to shifting their electrical grid over to so-called renewables, wind and solar. And at the same time, P&M here in New Mexico announced that they wanted people to use less electricity in their houses, in part due to just supply issues. Now, California at this point is much further along the path, but New Mexico is bound and determined to dramatically catch up, and very soon. And I know there's a lot of concerns about whether that will happen or not, but we're not going to spend time with them. You can just read Errors of Enchantment, read the numerous articles we've talked about this issue in, and definitely another concern going forward. August 26th, we had our dear Governor Knows Best podcast, which is definitely a highlight of the podcast genre. And if you GOV apostrophe in or knows best NOR, you can find a great parody video of Michelle Lujan Grisham. Broadband has become an issue, and in late August, I drew attention and a number of op-eds and whatnot to if you want broadband, stop taxing its deployment. We charge gross receipts tax as a state on companies deploying broadband around New Mexico. So 7-8% additional tax burden for the privilege of deploying broadband. It's not surprising that New Mexico, a big, poor, sparsely populated state, has some serious issues in regards to broadband, which now all of our kids are probably going to be using for the duration of the school year. In Labor Day weekend, I embarked upon my first plane flight since COVID-19 to go visit friends and family in Ohio. And I'll say at the end, it's now December 28th as we record this. I have yet to get the dreaded virus. It could happen any day, but I have, to the maximum extent of my capacity, tried to live my life in the most normal way possible and defied the governor in many, many, many ways.
Yes, this is an interesting thing is that the don't do this approach to human nature, I don't know how effective it is. It certainly hasn't been effective. And I don't know if things like masks and social distancing just don't work. There's certainly a case that they don't. But also there's this public facing thing where people are out there, wearing masks at Costco and at Walmart and at Smith's, but maybe in their homes they're having big parties. And I'm sensing there is some pushback in New Mexico, but it's quiet. I saw an event over the weekend, a parking lot on Eubank just south of Central. There was basically a street racing car show. Thousands of people there. It certainly wasn't formally organized, but not a mass to be found, and hundreds of people. A good time going on, and the police were in the area, so they knew about it, but they weren't doing anything about it. And so it's one of those things. If any of this matters, then I think it has to be couched in how can we get the maximum amount of COVID protection while we minimize the impact to us in our daily lives, not just do this. And then when it doesn't work, people really are starting to lose confidence in ever increasing numbers. There's a lot that still believe that everything we're doing is the right thing. But, the data is starting to come in, and this has been marketed as a science and data solving problem. Well, the science and the data is starting to show that a lot of what's being done has certainly not been effective.
Yeah, and as we hit the home stretch here towards the end of the year, Bernalillo County's commission adopted project labor agreements on public works projects. Then they promptly waived it for their first big project.
Good for thee, but not for me.
The West Side Visitor Center. So that one, bad law, gives unions disproportionate power and increases prices of those kinds of public works projects, but maybe they'll continue to waive them for future projects moving forward. On October the 2nd, I had Brian Riedel of the Manhattan Institute. He was discussing the federal budget disaster, and George Wilt cited heavily in his column over the weekend Brian Riedel, and I definitely encourage folks to listen to that podcast. Talk to Jim Peach here in October, on October the 12th. He's much more of a modern monetary theorist, although a relatively good economist and certainly a go-to for the New Mexico legislature. Certainly don't agree with everything he says, but he also gives a pretty good overview of the challenges facing New Mexico's economy moving forward. And as does Gary Hayes of Cliffs Amusement Park, we talk about all the businesses They can't do business. Gary Hayes has this amusement park that's over here in Albuquerque, and they have a outdoor water area as one example that was unopened the entire summer, entire spring, entire year here in New Mexico. The same exact thing is open at the Great Wolf Lodge in Scottsdale, Arizona, indoors. And that's just one of many things. Given some opportunities, he and other amusement park operators and recreational facility managers could innovate, but they were never given that opportunity. And heaven forbid, I really hope that the governor will allow Cliffs to open come March, which isn't that far around the corner. P&M was purchased by Avangrid in late October, and that seems like a big deal, and it could be a big deal, but it's ultimately the damage has kind of been done with regard to New Mexico's utility structure, thanks to the Energy Transition Act and mandates to now go 100% renewable. We'll see what Avangrid does. I expect that they'll raise rates and go back on as many of those 100% renewable policies as possible, but only time will tell. November election, some people could probably do an entire year end just on the election. Well, in New Mexico, the election was status quo from a legislative perspective, by and large. More progressive Senate, but if they weren't progressives before, they certainly haven't done a very good job of opposing those progressive economic policies. Certainly, there are some pre-K tapping the permanent fund, marijuana legalization, abortion, gun rights. Those are issues that are going to be battled over. It strikes me that most of the issues coming up will, the hot buttons will be social policy with some economics thrown in there. Obviously a lot of other aspects of this election, which are still being kind of discussed. And the final nail in the presidential election or the national elections will be in Georgia when both Senate races have their runoff in early January. So that really ends 2020's election in early January when we know who controls the Senate and how that all works. Governor Lujan Grisham enacted her second lockdown shortly after the election in November. I'm sure that was all science-based, Wally. No consideration made whatsoever for the election itself.
Well, as been pointed out, political science is a form of science, I guess. It has science in the name anyway.
Exactly. The main upshot of that, aside from shutting restaurants down pretty completely, was the onset of modern bread lines at grocery stores and big box stores. It saw people limited to 75 total occupants of a gigantic warehouse club or whatever, and waiting in lines for hours on end. Finally, the governor did relent and didn't say any, no apologies, no nothing, just went back to the 25% occupancy, which is fairly comfortable. You may encounter a line or two, about 10 minutes or so at some of these stores, but by and large, 25% is a whole different ball of wax from the 75-person threshold. Finally, last thing of the year, Netflix agrees to take even more of our money thanks to over-generous and extremely generous film subsidies here in New Mexico. That company, billion-dollar, not billion-dollar, it's hundreds of billions of dollar company, I think. They're getting 30% of their spending in New Mexico paid back by the taxpayers. They're getting a $24 million payment from the state, and they're also getting exemptions on their property taxes. And I just had an article that ran in National Review Online's website, and getting that ready to post. So that is where we come down at the end of very challenging 2020. I hope 2021 is better for all involved.
Absolutely. I sure do, Paula. It's been a great year. It's been enjoyable to do this. And till next year when things are improving, hopefully we'll make some progress between today, Monday, December 28th, when this is recording, and next Monday when it's 2021. We certainly need that to happen.
Thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter. Tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.